This
is Democracy,
a podcast that explores the interracial, intergenerational, and intersectional unheard voices living in the world's
most influential democracy.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week we're going to discuss the nature of Sunbelt politics, culture, and society in the United States. The Sunbelt is a term that historians, political pundits, and many others have used now for quite a while. We're going to explore what this term means and what this region of the country, what role it's played in our society over the last 50 to 70 years, and what role it plays today and might play tomorrow in the evolution of our democracy. We have with us one of the foremost scholars of this region, someone who's done some of the pioneering work on understanding Sunbelt politics and society. That's Michelle Nickerson. Michelle is an associate professor of history at Loyola University of Chicago. She teaches the history of American politics, women and gender, cities and religion. So she covers a wide range of issues. But she's not from the Sunbelt. She wanted us to make sure we made that clear. She was born in New Jersey, or where I grew up in New York, Jersey, we call it, where she got her undergraduate degree at Rutgers University. She moved to the Sunbelt after she finished her Ph.D. work at Yale. First to do research in Los Angeles and then to teach at the University of Texas at Dallas. Nickerson's first book, Michelle's first book, is a volume of essays called Sunbelt Rising that she co-edited with Darren Doshuk, and that has a variety of scholars contributing to understanding the politics of space, place, and region. And Michelle's sole-authored first book, which is really a groundbreaking book, is titled Mothers of Conservatism, Women and the Rise of the Postwar Right. Michelle was one of the first scholars really to get into the role of grassroots women's activism in the rise of right-wing politics in the Sunbelt during the Cold War, a book that really reshaped the way I think about the period and many others. So we're very lucky to have Michelle with us today. Thank you for joining us, Michelle.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Jeremi, and thanks for the kind introduction.
Well, it's so kind and wonderful for you to join us, and really a lot of fun to have you on. And we're going to turn, of course, to our scene-setting poem from Zachary to start us. You have a sonnet today, I understand, Zachary, yes?
Yes.
What's the title?
Sonnet for the Sunbelt.
Let's hear it.
In arid desert lies between the towns the bison that fell and the native men, who often felt the bullet's ceaseless rounds, and hope the migrants crossed the oceans then. And from the desert states were born, with dams that held the rivers back for good, with suburbia and the strip mall's thorn, and yearning kids stood among mesquite wood. And from the cacti flows the water spring. The neocons reach out from Midwest lakes to find dry heavens in the highway ring, slick border control in a desert of snakes. But now the faces change, so do the votes, and hark, new peoples come on hope-filled boats.
I love the range of issues you touch on there. What is your poem really about, Zachary?
My poem is really about the societal and cultural makeup of the Sunbelt, how dynamic it is and how it's changed dramatically over the past century or so.
Well, that's really the perfect introduction to Michelle's groundbreaking work. Michelle, what do scholars like yourself and political pundits mean when they refer to the Sunbelt? What are we talking about?
Well, first, I want to say to Zachary, that was incredible. Can you please send me a copy of that?
Of course.
And then thank you. So, scholars have been writing about the Sunbelt really for several decades now. And we tend to think of it as a region that's born out of the political economic circumstances of the post-World War II era. And when I first wrote about this, I and my co-editor, Darren Doshuk, thought it was more useful to think about the Sunbelt less as a regional concept than a conceptual region. And by that, I mean that it's born of ideologies from the time period, ideologies that basically govern political and economic relations in that place. For example, the earliest part of the Sunbelt And by that, when I say Sunbelt, I mean the southern rim of the United States, the states that go from, say, North Carolina, south to Florida, across to Arizona and California. But I have to be very careful about that because as a region, like all regions, it's not set in stone. You can't look at a map and really see any clear boundaries because with regions, boundaries are shifting all the time. And in many cases, well, in most cases, they're created in the mind. They represent people's understanding of place and space. Nevertheless, that is still very historically important. So when we talk about the Sunbelt as a conceptual region, we're talking about a place born after World War II, where people there and institutions tended to promote economic growth. They tend to be suspicious of centralized power. They had faith in low taxation. They tended to lack faith in unions. They were suspicious of government regulation, especially regulation from the federal government. It's a region that's defined also by migration, by the flow of people coming from the northern part of the United States to take advantage of these political economic circumstances. Also, it's about the Sunbelt was a place where there was a lot of trust in boosters and in economic boosters, mainly businessmen and politicians who wanted to create laws and policies that would promote growth, economic growth. It's a place also where you saw an enthusiasm for evangelical religion, Christian religion, where kind of the mainline churches of earlier periods tended to have less power than these newer churches. It was really on the forefront of mega church development. And it's a place where where political conservatism was really born as a movement in the sense that it took off and tended to dominate the politics of these places really as you're coming out of the 1950s. And the last thing I want to mention is that the Sun Belt is really defined more by the spaces of metropolitan areas rather than the states themselves. So we often talk about Sunbelt states, let's say like where you are in Texas or California, but it is as much about really, or more so about the development of Houston in this period, and Dallas and Austin and let's say Los Angeles or Phoenix than it is so much about what's happening at the level of state government, although that is, of course, also important, and we can get to that.
And what role, Michelle, has the federal government played? Because one of the really interesting insights, it seems to me, from this scholarship is that, as you said, many of the residents of these areas are critical of taxation and critical of the New Deal. But at the same time, if I understand the scholarship, they're recipients of disproportionate federal supports. Is that correct?
That's correct. And on a couple of fronts. First of all, the influx of dollars that go to the military-industrial complex after World War II, with the expansion of defense spending and the U.S. military, much of that money went to companies that are in the Sun Belt. Companies like Lockheed Martin, for example. And so people moved to these regions to work for those companies or work for companies that basically derived from that particular economy, like subsidiary companies. So you had, for example, a lot of engineers who moved from the Midwest to Los Angeles to take care of those benefits. The other thing that happened was the divestment of federal lands that went to places like Phoenix and other Sunbelt regions, where companies and governments managed to get from the federal government cheap land so that they could develop. And then third, you might also know that there are many indigenous nations in the Sunbelt, like the Navajo. And there are ways in which the federal government and the state governments managed to capture a lot of the energy that came out of those places and divert it to the metropolitan regions that benefited economically. So yes, disproportionately, the Sun Belt in this time period was getting money from the federal government. And so, yeah, there's kind of a disconnect there in how people understand their own relationship with the federal government. On the one hand, there was a lot of protest against federal power. And then on the other hand, there was a huge interest and effort in getting resources from the federal government.
And just so we're clear, who are the people we're talking about here? As you made it clear in your response right now, it's obviously not the native residents of the region who are the drivers of change. Who are the real drivers of change in the region in this period?
Well, there are many drivers of change, and it depends on what community and what level of government that you're talking about. So you and I right now are talking about the rise of conservatism mainly in this period, and the power of metropolitan governments and also boosters who were promoting growth. So when we're talking, the people that we're talking about would be prominent businessmen like Barry Goldwater in Phoenix, Arizona, who eventually runs for senator and he comes to lead the movement. So these would be, people who had money and influence, many of whom moved there. There was an anti-fair housing movement in Los Angeles that was very popular. Of course, the leader of which is totally escaping my mind at the moment. But they tended to be, in this period, Republican, and they tended to basically leverage the power that they had through their companies.
And what about your work on women? What role did women and minorities and other groups play outside of the circle of largely white businessmen?
So this is the other part of the story, right? Women began to exert a great deal of power, and so did non-white people. So for women, basically, as you know, this is the period, when we're talking about the 1950s and 60s, we're talking about the decades before the women's liberation movement, where there was attention to feminism again, and real activist power behind it. But in the 50s, with the interest in local development and kind of the politics of the community, people in the Sunbelt gave a great deal of authority to women because women stepped forward in the interests of their own local neighborhoods and communities. And other people were ready to kind of give them that power. So women had a lot of power in school politics. They had a lot of power in marshaling resources towards the development of things like playgrounds and other resources for children. This is partly because, well, there were many women who had those resources. They were, married to men who had money, or they came from families with money. These were mostly white women who, in many cases, immigrated from other parts of the country. And many of them had university education. Either they started college or they finished college. Some of the women I actually studied for my book had graduate degrees. But these were women who took their roles as housewives and mothers seriously. For a time, they stepped away from their role in the workplace to raise their children. But they were smart. They had the economic resources and they had the will to step in and participate in these politics at the very local level at a time when people took local politics really seriously. So that's the story of mainly white women. At the same time, there were women in, like, let's say Los Angeles, the Mexican American community, who were doing the same things for their own neighborhoods. So they themselves were going out and making sure that their children had had schools. They were active in fights against segregation. They they were there. I'm thinking about women, for example, in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles, or in Monterey, California, where they got very involved on behalf of the safety of their children. And just as the other communities, women were given the authority to do that and participate at the local level in a very intense way. It's not surprising that women stepped onto the school board in Los Angeles at this time period, in the Los Angeles Unified School District, and were stepping into positions of local government at the time. And this is happening in all kinds of communities. Once upon a time, historians called this type of activism maternalism, but I tend to think of it differently, what I call in my book, housewife populism, because these were not women who were using their class position to kind of reach down and help people who had less privilege than them, which is a very kind of progressive era tradition. On the contrary, these are women who are fighting for their own communities. They see their communities in some way as being endangered and in needing of their protection. And for white women conservatives, this meant protecting their communities against what they called big government, or the intervention of the federal government. So that's kind of where we see women. And then in terms of other communities, there's a great deal of civil rights activism that's happening alongside the conservative activism I talk about. And literally, I mean, right alongside. So I focus on Los Angeles County in my book. And I talk about the Los Angeles County of the conservative movement. At the same time, there's a tremendous amount of radical and civil rights politics happening in that very same place that becomes just as important to American politics. So, for example, it's Los Angeles where we saw in as early as 1947, the Mendez versus Westminster decision, which banned segregation in schools that were predominantly Mexican. In Texas, it was 1954 when we saw the Hernandez versus Texas decision that determined that a Mexican-American man had a right to a jury of his own peers. So there's a tremendous amount of energy in civil rights politics in the period and region we're talking about. What makes it different, I would say, and the way in which we might recognize this as kind of a development in the Sunbelt, is that it tended to be multiracial. So the freedom struggle in the South at this time was mainly what we understood to be for the rights of African Americans in that period, which was, of course, so important. And you might even think about it again in terms of what we see happening at this very moment with Black Lives Matter. In the Sunbelt, people were advocating for many of the same rights, but they were doing this in different ethnic communities, whether it be Mexican American, Indigenous, Asian American communities. And so that's one of the things that was important in the Sunbelt. Also, like in Los Angeles, you saw the emergence of multi-ethnic and racial organizing for things like fair housing. So people working in their own communities and then across communities to secure better conditions and services and rights.
This is a really important point, Michelle, about the, in a sense, coterminous development of conservative politics and multiracial civil rights politics, quite literally, as you said, next to one another in this region. Why is it that the Republican Party was able to capitalize on these dual developments more than the Democratic Party? Why did this region produce the Reagan Revolution, as it was called? And to this day, maybe it's changing now. We're going to talk about this in a few minutes. It's been the heart of the Republican Party. Why is that?
So, coming out of World War II, the Republican Party was based in New York, right? This was the party of Nelson Rockefeller.
Right.
Right. But then, as I mentioned before, there was so much development in the Sunbelt states, and they accumulated so much economic power that the Republican Party didn't quite know how to reckon with this. The Republican Party was becoming the party of, let's say, less government. It was the party that was actually protecting segregation from the civil rights movement at the time. And for that reason, the Republican Party was itself becoming less trusting of federal power and authority. And so what you see happening is that the ideology of the Sun Belt is now aligning more with what's happening in the Republican Party. There are, like, for example, many Southern Democrats that are leaving the Democratic Party because they don't support civil rights. They don't support desegregation. They wanted more local control over these issues. They wanted more state control over these issues. They did not like the Supreme Court decisions that were being hoisted upon them in the name of desegregation and integration. So what happens is when you combine that with the emergence of economic power, people like Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan managed to take control of the party. So the party that once belonged to Eisenhower and was moderate moving into the 1950s then becomes the party of conservatives as you're moving into the 1960s. It's no coincidence that conservatism becomes an actual movement with a name at the end of the 1950s. And this is largely because of Barry Goldwater's book, Conscience of a Conservative, where people came to see themselves as somebody with that name. They adopted it as a political identity, and it developed kind of a movement energy. And so then Los Angeles really replaces New York as kind of the home base of the Republican Party coming into the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s. Also, the power of evangelicals in the party. Evangelical religion is so strong in the Sun Belt, and it manages to become the actual site for much of the grassroots organizing behind the movement. Figures like Phyllis Schlafly, for example, who started the anti-ERA campaign, the very successful anti-ERA campaign. She manages to make churches themselves kind of the organizing base of a lot of this politics. And it's kind of out of that that energy and mobilizing that we see the emergence of the religious right. So all of these things make republicanism powerful in the Sun Belt and ultimately nationally as well.
It seems in recent years we've seen a really dramatic political shift in the Sun Belt. What are the political trends that have shaped the Sun Belt in the past 20 years or so?
Zachary, that is a really good point. I'm glad you asked me that, because I'm not so sure that the Sun Belt works as much for helping us to understand politics after 1980. So I mentioned before that the Sun Belt, like all regions, are conceptual. It's a way that people understand the importance of space and place. And it's important for us to understand history. But we also need to understand that regions are historically bound. That the Sun Belt really doesn't make any sense if we're trying to understand, let's say, the 19th century. And for that reason, once we get beyond 1980, I don't think that it has so much value for helping us to understand politics and economics. That said, I do think there are things that are happening in this part of the nation that become important for the United States overall. First of all, there's the importance of the border. Okay, so coming out of 1980, many Americans become way more concerned about people crossing the border and taking jobs and interfering with the rights of native-born people. This has a lot to do with immigration laws that are passed in the 1960s and the way in which we come to regard immigrants from Latin America, especially Mexico. And so for that reason, the local and state the politicians and government officials, they tend to work more closely and fight over the border. The other thing is the ways in which evangelical religion after 1970, it tends to take on a more economic ideology as part of its theology. So there is in coming out of many churches and evangelical communities a kind of pro-business and growth spirituality, and this is very powerful in Sunbelt in Sunbelt states like where you are, for example. I'm thinking of like T.D. Jakes in Dallas and his Potter's House Church, where much of the theology itself is bent towards self-actualization, and also self-actualization as a form of economic progress. It celebrates wealth and development. And that really hangs on after 1980 and becomes important. And I also think that the multiracial and multi-ethnic organizing established in the Sunbelt after, let's say, 1950 becomes more the case in the rest of the nation. So there's a way in which I think much of America has tended to learn from that. And it becomes more of a national trend. So, one of the things that we and my co-authors argued about when we were discussing the Sun Belt was, well, is Seattle a Sun Belt city? What about Denver? And there's a way in which many of these metropolitan regions after 1980 tend to mirror the developments that we saw in the Sun Belt before that year, and really bring into question the value of understanding politics and economics and even culture through a Sunbelt lens after 1980.
It's a really helpful answer, Michelle. It does strike me that the Sunbelt region that produces these Cold War communities that support Republican politics, Phoenix, Arizona being a clear example, Houston, Texas, another, Los Angeles, they become, after the 1980s, they actually become very multiracial, progressive areas. Almost all the large metropolitan regions of the Sun Belt now vote against the Republican Party. If you think about Texas, if you think about the changes in Phoenix. I mean, so do you see that as a continuation of Sun Belt politics? How do you fit that into the narrative?
This is so important, Jeremi. So I think what we're seeing right now, and let's say Orange County is the classic example. Think about the Orange County of Lisa McGurr's book,
right.
And then the Orange County of, the after the millennium. So what I think happened is that at the local level, Sunbelt cities drew all kinds of people, not just white conservatives. And they themselves, like if you look at Houston and you look at Los Angeles, these communities are now more diverse than places like Milwaukee, and even where I live in Chicago. And then out of this kind of mix of ethnic politics emerges new leaders. It shouldn't surprise us, for example, especially after our discussion of women in the Sunbelt after 1950, that we're seeing so many women become mayors of these cities and leaders in official political positions that they didn't have in the 1950s. Also, many non-white government officials, for the same reasons, are taking charge. And so, in many ways, this is kind of the realization of the migration and the changes and all of the things that drew many different people to Sunbelt cities and metropolitan areas. They drew people from within the United States and from across the border. And I don't just mean the border into Mexico. I mean, they're drawing people from across the Pacific Rim and other parts of the world as well.
It's such an extraordinary story. Having grown up in New York City, I remember having conversations with old friends a few years ago about the challenges of bringing new communities into politics and how hard it was to convince people in New York, my old friends, Michelle, that Houston in many ways had more progressive politics than New York City. For example, Houston, Texas had a lesbian mayor before any other major city in the United States. And it makes sense considering the historical dynamics you've described. But of course, it runs against our stereotypes of these regions. In some ways, our stereotypes are of the old Sun Belt, not what the region is becoming. How should young activists, this is really where we wanted to conclude today, how should young activists who care about Black Lives Matter and many other progressive developments in our society, and those perhaps on the other side, how should they think about this region? What role can they play either as actors in this region or as people appealing to this region? Where do you see the future of politics of this region going?
Well, first, Jeremi, I want to step back a minute to that conversation that you had with your friends in New York City. This question of why is Houston as a city so progressive? And, this was my experience in Dallas as well. Dallas, when I lived there, was a city that voted for Democrats. But that was not the case for the suburbs of Dallas. And the suburbs of Houston are another story altogether. And this has a lot to do with the problem of where these metropolitan regions fit into the larger landscape of power in their states and at the national level. So in the state of Texas right now, a city like Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio can be a majority Democrat, and it can have a really rich tradition of progressive politics, yet that doesn't translate at the state level. And it doesn't necessarily translate at the federal level as well. And so when we're talking to a younger generation about why that is and how it needs to change, we need to think about the problem of democratic institutions right now, which are really troubled. And the role that the Black Lives Matter movement, and by that I mean the energy, the momentum right now, that's coming from the generation that started that movement and that leads that movement. It's really important, and it really should remind us of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s and the power that it can have. But what it needs to do, I think, is focus on reforming these problematic institutions. So first of all, I think that we all have a lesson to learn from those Sunbelt conservatives who managed to take a lot of their resources and put it into the mechanisms of state level power. So think of ALEC or the Koch brothers and the way they focused so much of their energy on state legislatures, while the Democrats and other progressives were looking at swing states and the presidency. And for that reason, I think that, Tom DeLay, for example, from Sugar Land, managed to lead the gerrymandering campaign. So one of the things that needs to happen is that progressives need to focus on reversing gerrymandering. They need to focus on restoring voting rights. And once things change at the state level with state legislators and governors, then they can do things like think about a 28th Amendment to secure voting rights and stop voter suppression. We need to kind of reverse a lot of these changes that made us less democratic at all of these levels. We need people to vote more and to get in there and assure that other people can vote, to take voting seriously. I don't know about you, but when I talk to students in my classes, they are so frustrated with the institutions of government right now. And for that reason, many of them didn't even vote in 2016 and in other elections. And they tell me I'm ridiculous to be working so hard to get people out to vote because they don't think that voting matters. Well, it's time to take that seriously as a way to reform the institutions of democratic life that have interfered with their own rights and everybody else's rights at the same time. And so that would be the lesson that I would take from the Sunbelt, what I would describe as the Sunbelt era of American history after 1950.
Michelle, that's so powerful, not the least bit ridiculous. It's incredibly inspiring, in fact, and fits with the main themes of our podcast. What you've shown in your work and in your really brilliant overview of that work today is how the Sun Belt and the changes in the Sun Belt in some ways contributed to changes in our institutions that undermined some of the values of democracy that we hold so dear, especially contributing to gerrymandering and powerful business interests that have always been part of our democracy, but maybe operated in a new way as a consequence. And that learning the lessons of that history can help us to see where we need to reform and change those institutions again, particularly working at the state level. As you were speaking, I was thinking about the ways in which many of these Sunbelt states opened so quickly during the early weeks of the coronavirus.
Yes.
And we're seeing the consequences of that today. Who were they responding to? Who was the governor of Texas responding to? Not to the citizens of Austin and Dallas and Houston, but to those same business interests and others that came to powerful positions during the period you studied. And that's something we need to address. I think that's at the center of your work, isn't it?
It is so interesting to me that, obviously we're talking about this now because it's in the midst of this pandemic that I'm looking at these maps and these articles and thinking, oh my God, there still is a Sun Belt. And it gets to, I think, exactly what you're talking about is the suspicion of state authorities to interfere with the interests of business. I think it was it a hairdresser in Dallas that brought so much attention to the way she was treated by authorities? Okay, I think that's the perfect example of the way in which, sure, I mean, I think that people should rally around their local businesses, but the way in which people sort of pitch this as a conflict between the health of the economy and small business versus the authority of the state to come in and impose rules. I thought to myself, yes, okay. Also, you have a governor in Texas who is like a direct line from George W. Bush. And so the ways in which Greg Abbott waited so long to enforce masks, I think goes back to this era from which he derived his own thinking and his power. The other thing, I don't know about you, but I think I hate to use seasons and temperature as a way to understand the distinctions of the Sunbelt. But, when we were in lockdown, when everybody was in lockdown, I think that here in Chicago, we were suffering in particular, and our numbers were going so high perhaps because we were all indoors in March and April. And I think that in Texas and other states across the South, it was, the temperature was very mild. And so people could do what they needed to do outdoors. And so the virus itself, I think, didn't inflict as much punishment and have an impact as it did in the northern states. And now, in many ways, that's reversed. You're in the midst of super summer in Texas. And so everybody is confined in these air-conditioned places with poor ventilation. And the rest of the nation is kind of spreading out, doing what they need to do outside. They don't feel as trapped. And so I think that also might have something to do with it.
It's absolutely correct. And the frustrating thing, and it comes right back to your core point about the changes in the Sun Belt over time, is that most health experts were predicting exactly this development, but yet the politics that carry over from, as you say, from the 1980s and 90s were of deep suspicion in many of these Sun Belt states toward the health experts. And that suspicion of expertise, which I think is built into the housewife populism that you're talking about,
Yes.
I think
Yeah.
that contributed, and it's almost as if we're living through a pattern that is so historically predictable, but yet it seems this is your point about frustration. Until we reform our institutions, we can't get out of this pattern.
This is something that we just didn't talk about, but yeah, the fusion of medical expertise and federal government power is something that people become suspicious of after 1950, and you're seeing it again right now.
Zachary, this is a lot of really meaty and sophisticated material that Michelle has given us here, but she's also so brilliantly connected it to our contemporary politics. Do you find this empowering for young citizens like yourself who believe in reform, who care deeply about it? Is thinking about Sunbelt politics in this way, is it helpful for you moving forward, and how?
I think it definitely is, and I would say the main way is that it shows us how important local political activism away from centers of political power is. And one more thing I'd like to add too is that we've seen a vast increase in immigration and demographic shifts in this region in the past 20 years or so. And I think that's going to be really powerful because instead of relying on old ideas of whiteness and of suburban politics in the United States, and particularly in Sunbelt states, I think that young people have grown up around people who look very different from them and have very different political ideologies. And I think young people are beginning to finally grasp that politics is not necessarily rooted in our race or in where we live. And I think that's something that the Sun Belt is actually going to teach us in the next few decades.
Well, and on all of this echoes, I think, one of the central lessons of American history, which is that there is a cyclical process at work, I think. And Michelle has uncovered for us. Yeah, please.
Can I just respond to Zachary?
Please.
So I think what Zachary said is so important. Also, please excuse me, Zachary, if I'm pinning something on you, but, this kind of okay boomer attitude of millennials and Gen Z towards the older generation, I think is kind of something that is quite prevalent right now and important. At the same time, I would urge people to just kind of look at themselves and what they're thinking when they are questioning the authority and the whiteness of the boomer generation. So, for example, one of the things that's inspired me, I study radicals now. That's a whole nother story. But one of the people that I studied from the anti-Vietnam War era, as a retired person, he is now very much involved with the movement against gerrymandering in Pennsylvania. He wouldn't say it. His name's Keith Forsyth. But I think he's been on the forefront to undo that trend, and quite successfully in Pennsylvania. I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from activists of earlier periods, even if you don't accept their authority or question their authority. So I urge people to go into these progressive movements with confidence, but also to evaluate their attitudes about other people as they go into it. I think that can be really healthy.
I think that's a perfect note to close on. Michelle, thank you for not just your historical wisdom based on deep research, but also on your passion for democratic and progressive change today, and for the really powerful ways you connect your historical scholarship to contemporary political reform. That's what our podcast is all about, and you embody that. so well. So thank you for joining us today, Michelle.
Thank you, Jeremi. This was really exciting and such a pleasure. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Zachary, as well. And of course, thank you to our listeners for joining us for this episode of This is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts Development Studio and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harrison Lemke, and you can find his music at harrisonlemke.com.
Subscribe and stay tuned for a new episode every Thursday featuring new perspectives on democracy.